Between two Indonesian islands runs an ancient line that simultaneously exists and doesn't. You won't see it on a world map, you won't notice it standing on the shore, and if you board a boat and sail through the strait, you won't feel any resistance. And yet, it's there. If you were standing on the east coast of Bali and looking east toward neighboring Lombok, you would be looking directly at the narrowest point of this line, a 32-kilometer stretch of water that looks completely unremarkable. Azure water, gentle ripples, the occasional dolphin, the occasional fishing boat, an ordinary tropical strait. But this is no ordinary strait. It is one of the sharpest ecological boundaries on the planet. On one side are tigers, elephants, rhinos, monkeys, woodpeckers. On the other side are marsupials, cockatoos, honey-eaters, and, most famously, Komodo dragons, giant lizards that look more like surviving dinosaurs than modern reptiles. And these two worlds exist literally 32 kilometers apart. No smooth transition, no intermediate species. One biological reality ends abruptly, and an entirely different one begins. This is the Wallace Line, and today we'll explore how it formed, why it's so sharp, how it was discovered by someone who lived a century and a half ago, and how it relates to plate tectonics, which hadn't yet been discovered in his time. Get ready, because the story of this invisible boundary is the story of how geology defines biology, how two worlds that stand opposite each other today were once separated by thousands of kilometers, and how the echoes of that ancient divide still resonate in every cockatoo call and every tiger roar. The Wallace Line was first drawn on a map in 1859 by a man named, well, you won't believe it, Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace, to be precise, a British naturalist whom you may also know as the co-author of the theory of natural selection. Yes, the very theory we associate with Darwin was actually independently discovered by two people. Wallace conceived it in a literal feverish delirium, bedridden with malaria during his 8-year expedition through the Malay archipelago. It was on the island of Ternate in February 1858. Wallace was tossing and turning in a fever, alternating periods of lucidity with periods of confusion. And it was during one of these feverish episodes that the entire concept of natural selection took shape. He later recalled that the idea came to him in its entirety, like a revelation, while he lay shivering with malarial chills, wrapped in blankets in the midst of the tropical heat. The idea came to him during a bout of fever. He quickly jotted it down and mailed it to Darwin, with whom he corresponded. Darwin received the letter in June 1858 and was horrified. He had been developing the same idea for 20 years, but had always put off publication, fearing public backlash. To avoid giving Wallace all the credit, Darwin urgently arranged a joint presentation at the Linnean Society of London, where both papers were read simultaneously. A year later, he published his celebrated Origin of Species, which brought him worldwide fame. Wallace remained in the shadows, although the theory should rightly bear the names of both scientists. But this didn't particularly upset him. Wallace had another remarkable idea on that voyage, and it was this idea that made him the father of a new science, biogeography. And this idea concerned precisely that same invisible line. Wallace spent 8 years island hopping across the Malay archipelago, the largest island group on the planet, comprising more than 25,000 islands. He collected plant and animal specimens, observed the local fauna, and sent home collections of insects, birds, and mammals. He was a true Victorian-era field scientist, with a net, a shotgun, diaries, and an endless curiosity. And then, when he moved from Bali to Lombok, simply crossing that same 32 kilometers straight, something strange happened. The animal world around him changed beyond recognition. It was as if he had landed on another planet. In Bali, he saw typical Asian fauna: woodpeckers, tigers, monkeys, hornbills. On Lombok, 32 kilometers to the east, none of this was to be found. Instead, there are cockatoos, honey-eaters, and couscouses, a completely different set of species. Wallace wrote in his notes that the differences between the fauna of Bali and Lombok were more striking than those between England and Japan. Imagine that. 2 islands that can be crossed by boat in a few hours, and the difference in fauna is as great as between the 2 ends of Eurasia. The birds were the first to catch his attention. Certain species that were abundant on Java and Bali, the yellow-headed weaver, the lesser barbet, the Javan 3-toed woodpecker, were simply absent from Lombok. Not rarer, not slightly different, they simply weren't there. And the skies of Lombok were filled with entirely different birds than those on Bali. And it wasn't just the birds. The same was true for mammals, reptiles, and even many insects. It was as if someone had drawn an invisible line across the seabed and said, "This way only Asian species, and this way only Australian ones." Wallace couldn't understand it. Why were islands separated by such a narrow strait so dramatically different from one another? Why didn't the fauna intermingle, as would be logical? Why were the changes not gradual, but sudden? And so he began to dig deeper. The line he drew reflected more than just the proximity of islands to one another. In fact, some islands on opposite sides of the line were closer to one another than islands on the same side. It was a true paradox. Wallace realized that there were more mysterious forces at work behind this boundary, and his genius lay in his insight. These forces were geological. He understood that the geological past determines the biological present, that the distribution of living things today reflects ancient events that took place millions of years ago, and that biogeography could be a window into the history of the planet, a way to learn about Earth's past through the study of life today. Today, this idea seems obvious to us. We talk about it constantly. But in 1859, when Wallace formulated it, it was a true revolution in thought. Applying this new approach, Wallace reached a number of startling conclusions. He concluded that the western islands of the archipelago, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Bali, were all once connected to each other and to the Asian mainland. Today, they are surrounded by shallow seas, but this, he believed, is a consequence of a relatively recent rise in sea level. Otherwise, how could tigers, rhinoceroses, tapirs, and orangutans have ended up on these islands? These large animals cannot cross wide straits. This means they must have once arrived there by land, before any straits existed. Wallace reached a similar conclusion about the eastern islands, New Guinea, Australia, and some of the Maluku Islands. At least some of them, he believed, were once the remnants of some former Australian continent. Between these two submerged continents, Wallace concluded, there must have been deep waters with strong currents that prevented species from migrating from one world to the other, even when sea levels were lower. And these deep waters continue to separate the two worlds to this day. Even many flying birds and insects respect this line, simply because they are incapable of crossing open ocean over long distances. A bird can fly across a narrow channel if it's small and if it's a good flyer, but when faced with miles of open water ahead, most birds simply turn around. Wallace assembled many pieces of this puzzle, but he was missing one key element to complete the picture. That element is called plate tectonics. The surface of our planet, as we know it today, is not static. It is dynamic. It is composed of large fragments, plates, that move, collide, and diverge over vast timescales. This is another concept we take for granted today. But in fact, plate tectonics is a relatively new idea. It only gained widespread acceptance in the late 1960s, more than half a century after Wallace's death. When Wallace was developing his theories, most geologists believed that the continents had always been in place. The idea of continental drift seemed like a wild fantasy. And even when German meteorologist Alfred Wegener proposed the theory in the early 20th century, it was long ridiculed. In 1912, Wegener published his theory of continental drift, based on a simple observation. The outlines of South America and Africa match like two pieces of torn paper, and rocks on both sides of the Atlantic contain fossils of the same species, clearly older than the ocean itself. Wegener proposed that all the continents were once a single, massive supercontinent, which he called Pangaea, which then broke apart, and the pieces drifted apart. The idea was entirely correct, but Wegener lacked a convincing mechanism. He couldn't explain the force that moves the continents, and the scientific community rejected him. They called him an eccentric, his theory poetry. Wegener died in 1930 during an expedition to Greenland, never having received recognition. Only with the advent of new data on magnetic stripes on the ocean floor, deep sea trenches, and earthquakes in the 1960s did it become clear that Wegener was right. And then, everything fell into place. Plate tectonics explains the nature of the Wallace Line. Today, we know that the Malay Archipelago is one of the most tectonically complex regions on the planet. Several major plates, The Eurasian, Indo-Australian, Philippine, and Pacific, and numerous smaller microplates meet here. They push each other, slide under each other, create volcanoes, and trigger earthquakes. This tectonic chaos is precisely why Indonesia is one of the most seismically active countries in the world. Consider the catastrophic eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, whose explosion was heard 5,000 kilometers away, or the tragic tsunami of 2004, which claimed more than 200,000 lives, or the Tambora explosion of 1815, which caused the year without a summer in Europe and the Americas. All of this is a consequence of the convergence of several tectonic plates here, and the Earth's crust being torn into dozens of fragments. But the same tectonics that creates geological catastrophes also created the archipelago's ecological mosaic. By the 1980s, scientists could confidently say that the Wallace Line is in fact the result of plate tectonics. To understand exactly how, let's look into the deep past. Wallace was right when he proposed that two distinct continents once existed on either side of the line. Today, we know them as Sunda and Sahul. Sunda was the western paleocontinent, comprising today's Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Bali, and the Malay Peninsula, connected to Southeast Asia. Sahul was the eastern paleocontinent, encompassing Australia, Tasmania, New Guinea, and the Aru Islands. Both of these continents existed during ice ages, when more water was locked up in ice and sea levels were significantly lower than today. Back then, it was possible to walk between Bali and Borneo without getting your feet wet, and between Australia and New Guinea too. But even then, even at their lowest sea levels, Sunda and Sahul remained separated by a strait of deep water. And it was this strait that prevented species from crossing it, no matter how low the ocean level fell. But here's what Wallace couldn't have known, and what makes this story even more astonishing. Today, Sunda and Sahul stand close together, but they used to be very, very far away. The Australian plate, which included Sahul, moved north for tens of millions of years after breaking away from Antarctica. Imagine that journey. 150 million years ago, Australia was stuck to Antarctica, somewhere far south near the South Pole. It was cold there were glaciers, there lived creatures adapted to the cold. Then, Australia began to separate and crawl north. Millions upon millions of years, it moved toward the equator, crossing different climate zones, changing its biology. And only about 20 to 25 million years ago, in the late Oligocene or early Miocene, did it come close enough to Asia to establish biogeographic contact with it. Almost 130 million years of its life were spent in complete isolation. During this time, Australian fauna evolved in a completely unique way. This is precisely why marsupials, mammals that carry their young in a pouch rather than with a placenta, developed there. Kangaroos, koalas, wombats, thawed quolls, and Tasmanian devils all are related, all a legacy of that long isolation. And once upon a time, Australia was home to true giants, the marsupial lions, Thylacoleo, the size of a modern leopard, with claws like a bear and jaws capable of crushing bone. There were also diprotodons, marsupials the size of rhinoceroses. There were giant flightless birds, the henicornis and dromornis, each weighing half a ton. All this fauna lived and evolved on an isolated continent. Echidnas and platypuses appeared there, relict creatures, living fossils, preserving the features of early mammals that disappeared from the rest of the world back in the time of the dinosaurs. The platypus seems like a joke of nature. It lays eggs like a reptile, has a beak like a duck, swims like an otter, and the males are venomous. Such madness is only possible under conditions where evolution took place for tens of millions of years in complete isolation. Cockatoos, lyrebirds, honey-eaters, and birds of paradise also evolved there. A whole parallel world, completely unlike the Asian one. And in the north, on the Sunda, a different evolution was underway. Tigers, elephants, rhinoceroses, tapirs, monkeys, and orangutans developed there. Woodpeckers and Barbary bears flew there. Fauna related to those in India, China, and Southeast Asia lived there. And when Australia finally came close to Asia, these two worlds met. But they did not merge, because between them there still remained deep water, which Wallace correctly identified as a barrier. Even during the deepest ice ages, these waters did not dry up, and species could not cross them. It was as if, after 130 million years of separation, two different evolutionary episodes met, staged on the same stage but separated by an invisible wall. Asian tigers looked across the strait at Australian kangaroos, but they could not approach each other. But plate tectonics did something else remarkable. At the collision zone of the Australian and Eurasian plates, right at the juncture of two worlds, it created a whole chain of new islands. These islands, Sulawesi, Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, Timor, and dozens of others, were never connected to either Sunda or Sahul. They emerged from the sea as volcanic protrusions and uplifted areas of the sea floor in relatively recent geological time. This region was named Wallacea, after the scientist himself, and it is biologically one of the most interesting places on the planet. Wallacea is an ecological blank slate, waiting to be inhabited by creatures from both sides. It's as if you placed a no-man's land between two countries and declared, "Let anyone who can come here, come." Who came? Well, it turns out that more came from the Australian side, because while the Wallace Line acts as a barrier, it acts slightly differently for different creatures. Some Australian species found it easier to migrate to these new islands than their Asian counterparts. As a result, Wallacea inherited mostly Australian biological coloration. The most famous inhabitant of this zone is the Komodo dragon, a giant lizard reaching 3 meters in length and weighing up to 70 kilograms. It is the largest living predator among lizards and looks like a creature from the Mesozoic era. Its bite is fatal. Its saliva contains dozens of species of bacteria and a weak venom. Even if the victim escapes with a minor wound, it dies within a few days from infection or poisoning. Komodo dragons, with their excellent sense of smell, calmly follow a blood trail and find it. They hunt deer, wild boar, and buffalo, and have even been known to attack humans. Komodo dragons today inhabit several islands in eastern Indonesia: Komodo, Rinca, Flores, and Gili Motanga. Only about 3,000 remain, and they are endangered. But fossils of their ancestors first appear not in Indonesia, but in continental Australia, more than 3 million years ago, during the Pliocene. Their closest fossil relative is Megalania, a giant monitor lizard up to 7 meters long that lived in Australia about 50,000 years ago, possibly even encountering the first humans to arrive on the continent. This means that monitor lizards evolved in Australia and then migrated north, moving from island to island until they reached their current home in Wallacea about 1 million years ago. This is an Australian lizard, which everyone thinks is Indonesian, and this is a perfect illustration of how Wallace's line works. Monitor lizards were able to swim across relatively small straits within Wallacea, but they couldn't make it further west through deeper waters to Bali and Borneo. Although it would seem that Indonesia has plenty of suitable islands for a huge predatory lizard, an invisible line keeps them out. And this continues to this day. Today, as sea levels rise and both former continents fragment into numerous islands, Wallace's line remains as effective as it was millions of years ago. Deep waters with strong currents between Bali and Lombok, between Borneo and Sulawesi, still hinder the dispersal of most species. This is why the differences between the two sides of the line are still so striking. Of course, some species crossed it, by air, on floating trees, in the stomachs of birds, but most did not. And so we get this astonishing picture. Tigers don't swim across the narrow Lombok Strait, even though the nearest Australian coast is not that far. Cockatoos don't fly west, even though they could. Each species remains on its own side of the line because its ancestors followed their evolutionary path in isolation. And now comes the most interesting part. There's another curious aspect to this story. Wallace's line isn't the only biogeographic boundary in the region. Other scientists later proposed their own versions: Huxley's line, Lidecker's line, Weber's line. Each of them differs slightly from Wallace's line and reflects the distribution of different animal groups. Together, these lines form a broad transition zone, the aforementioned Wallacea. It's not a single, clear boundary, but a blurred strip where different species meet their barriers in different places. Mammals respect Wallace's line. Some birds respect Weber's line. Marine mollusks even have their own, vaguely defined one. Life doesn't obey a single rule. It follows many rules simultaneously, each reflecting its own part of geological history. This invisible line, first sketched by Wallace in 1859, continues to fascinate biogeographers. It's not real in the physical sense. There's no barrier there, no fence, no wall. But it is absolutely real in the sense of evolutionary history. It shows how powerfully ancient geological events can reverberate through time, and how they shape the diversity and distribution of life in the most bizarre and contrasting ways. And the central lesson of this story is that nature is not random. Every range, every boundary of a species' distribution, every strange aggregation of some creatures and the absence of others, all of these have a story. It's a story of the movement of continents, the rise and fall of sea levels, the opening and closing of straits. Life is not simply a collection of organisms distributed across the planet. It is a geological record, written not in stone, but in living beings. Every tiger in the Indonesian jungle, every cockatoo in the Australian forests, every Komodo dragon on its tiny island is a living page in the history of the Earth, a witness to tectonic processes that have been going on for millions of years. While Darwin received almost all the credit for explaining how species arise, Wallace still deservedly holds the title of pioneer in another area. He explained how species got where they are. These two questions, how and where, seem connected at first glance, but in fact they require very different approaches and reveal very different facets of evolution. Darwin said, "Here is the mechanism that produces new species." Wallace said, "Here are the reasons why these new species are distributed across the planet in the way they are." And together, they created modern biology, two parts of one great idea. Without one, there would be no full understanding of the other. If you ever find yourself in Indonesia and look out from a beach in Bali at the blue stripe of Lombok on the horizon, remember that you are looking at one of the most striking lines on our planet. An invisible boundary created by billions of tons of shifting crust and hundreds of millions of years of isolated evolution. A boundary between two worlds once separated by tens of thousands of kilometers, now facing each other, yet still as impenetrable as ever. Remember Alfred Russel Wallace, the man who, delirious with malaria in a squalid hut, managed to discern this line when no one else could. Genius often comes not from comfort, but from struggle. Not from offices, but from the jungle. Share in the comments which part of this story impressed you most. Australia's journey north across half the world, the parallel evolution of two worlds, or the fact that Wallace's line is still revered by almost all the animals in the region. And don't forget to subscribe. The planet still holds many invisible boundaries that tell us about its past, and we'll definitely return for them. See you there.